Okay, so now that we've kind of gone through the recap of what it means to have utility and to have marginal utility and what's the difference, I want to talk about two more related terms in marginal, quote-unquote, marginal analysis. Two more related margin terms, okay? So what are those? So first, let's just talk about what a margin is. So like how utility of consuming 6 goods is like a total amount, and marginal utility is the utility you get from going from the 5th to the 6th beer or whatever, the 5th or the 5th or the 6th good. It's the additional utility from consuming that 6th unit of good or 6th beer or whatever. Okay, marginal relates to the next unit. So your marginal utility is the utility from the next unit that you consume, going from 5th to the 6th. That's your marginal utility. The change in utility going from the next unit, going to the next unit. Similarly, your marginal benefit is going to be the benefit that you receive from consuming or producing the next unit of that good. Okay, so it could be marginal utility. So marginal utility, marginal benefit are related, but it could also be like a dollar amount, for example. So you could say that my marginal benefit of producing the next good is $2 because you're going to make $2 from that good. Okay, so marginal benefit is the benefit you get from consuming the next, or consuming or producing the next additional unit. Okay, and then so it's closely related and often interchangeable with marginal utility. And then the next topic, just like there's marginal utility, marginal benefit, there's marginal cost. And what is that? Your marginal cost is going to be the additional cost of consuming or producing the next unit. And where do these come from? Well, these just derive by your preferences. So whenever you have a model, economists will just assume some sort of preference structure. Typically, they're going to assume that it's going to be the shape that you're used to with the diminishing marginal utility, but it doesn't always have to be. It could be a straight line utility. It could be increasing utility over time, or increasing utility over consumption. It could be negative utility. You can have negative utility. I have negative utility from breathing cigarette smoke. I would rather not consume any cigarette smoke, and if you blow it in my face, I would be displeased. But economists will assume some sort of utility structure and bake it into the model, and then from there you can use that in conjunction with other assumptions, the other abstractions you make about the situation for that model, and you can use that to solve and come up with a predictable consumption pattern for that model. So utilities, all I'm saying is that utilities are essentially assumed into the model, and they're usually assumed as a certain preference type depending on what you're trying to say. And I don't know if you remember, we have my buddies here. I don't know if you remember from before, but the utility framework does have kind of a default utilitarian philosophical viewpoint, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So different economists, depending on what they're trying to say, might shy away from straight utility as a utilitarian framework. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry about it. But if you were interested in the first lecture when I talked about this and you remember it, cool. Utility is not a it's almost by default utilitarian, the greatest good for the greatest number, but it doesn't always have to be. You can bake in other utility functions that value altruism or libertarianism or deontological philosophical beliefs. If any of you guys are philosophy majors, that's important to know that that utility doesn't have to be utility in the economic sense doesn't have to be greatest good for the greatest number, even though that's kind of the default. And that's a point I like to stress, just because a lot of economists don't actually understand that, I feel like, and it is important to know that when you're making policy prescriptions, because it bakes into the positive claims somewhat of a normative claim. But hopefully the economists who deal with that kind of thing do understand that, but in general, I don't think that's always the case. Yeah, so let's throw this marginal analysis into an example. Okay, so I got a buddy, and his preferences are given as follows. So he has a utility function that when he consumes 1 beer, it's going to be equal to 10, and a utility function where he consumes 2 beers, it's going to be equal to 12. 3 beers is going to be equal to 12.5. That's his total utility. And then he's got a certain cost for it, and this will be generated by probably his opportunity cost. So there's going to be baked in some explicit cost. So maybe one beer costs $1, 2 beers cost $2. But he's going to have some opportunity costs for what he can use that other dollar for as well. So that'll be his true economic cost. Okay, the explicit cost from $1 plus the opportunity cost from where else that dollar can be spent. Maybe the opportunity cost of his time to go get the beer, or the opportunity cost of calories, or the opportunity cost from a potential hangover, what that'll do to his time tomorrow. That's all baked into the cost that you see here, this cost here. Okay, so my buddy Abby, he goes to his local beer shop, it's a 6-pack store, and he doesn't know how many bottles he wants to get. He has the option to fill up a 6-pack, or just to buy, or I guess in this case it's a 4-pack. My big old head is kind of cropping that, so let me move my big old head out of the way. There you go. But he has the opportunity to fill up a 4-pack, or to just buy beers a la carte. You can just buy them. He can buy 1 beer, 2 beers, and put it in the little thing and just go. Okay, he doesn't have to buy all 4 beers. But so how should Abby make his decision? Should he buy 1 beer, 2 beers, 3 beers, no beers? What should he buy? So we have his opportunity, or sorry, we have his cost, we have his utility, so we can actually make a claim about what is rational for Abby to buy. Okay, what makes sense for him to buy, and we can do that using the marginal utility and marginal cost framework, and I'll show you. So if he consumes 0 beers, he gets 0 utility. If he consumes 1 beer, he gets 10 utility. What's his marginal utility from consuming 1 beer? It's 10. His first beer gives him 10 pleasure, 10 level units of pleasure. Okay. What's his marginal utility from consuming that second beer? Well, it's going to be the utility of 12 minus 10. So it's going to be, his marginal utility is going to be 2. Okay, so consuming a second beer makes him a little bit happier, but not as happy as the first beer. What about the third beer? 0.5, 12.5 minus 12. What about the fourth beer? You all should do this in your head. It should be 0.25, because 12.75 minus 0.5, or minus 12.5. Okay, so consuming the first beer makes him very happy. Consuming the second beer makes him slightly less happy. Consuming the third beer makes him even less happy. But overall, or I shouldn't say it makes him less happy, it makes him more happy, but at a lesser level. He's still getting additional utility, but the fourth beer doesn't matter to him as much as the first beer. Okay, what about his cost? So he pays 3.5 units, let's say $3.5, even though it's even though there's some explicit some opportunity cost baked into that. But he pays 3.5 units of utility for the first unit. So what's his marginal cost going from the 0th unit to the first unit? Well, it should be 3.5. Here's my... Okay, what about going from the first unit to the second unit? How much would he be willing to pay, or what would be the additional amount that he has to pay to buy the second unit? Well, it should be 1.5. Okay, 5 minus 3.5. And how much would he have to pay going from the second unit to the third unit? Well, it's only 0.75. And then 0.5. So in this case, the actual cost is going to be decreasing over time. And this is actually common, right? Buying 5 beers versus buying 6 beers, right, isn't going to be as expensive as buying 1 beer, right? You buy a 6-pack, you're going to get some sort of bundling price, generally speaking. Maybe not every beer store. Or if you buy like a 6-pack of soda, it's not going to be as costly as going to a vending machine buying 6 individual cans of soda. Okay, that's pretty common, right? Okay, but we have his marginal utilities, we have his marginal costs. So what can we say about consuming the first beer? So if he just consumes one beer, he's going to be really happy and he's only going to pay 3.5 for it. So it makes sense for him to buy one beer, at least one beer, right? He's going to get 10 levels of utility and he's only going to pay 3.5 levels of utility. Or, if we're quoting utility in dollars, he's going to pay $10, or he's going to get $10. He's going to be willing to pay $10 and he's only going to have to pay $3.5. So it makes sense for him to consume at least one unit of beer. What about the second unit? Well, yeah, going from the first unit to the second unit, he's still happier. He's getting 2 units of utility, or $2, or whatever you want to quote it as. And he's only paying 1.5 units. So, yeah, it makes sense for him to consume a second beer because he becomes happier than he has to pay. His utility outranks his cost. What about the third beer, though? So he gets an additional level of happiness of 0.5, but he pays an additional level of cost of 0.75. So his happiness to cost doesn't actually make sense in this case. He'd rather buy 2 beers, get 12 utility, and pay, 5 costs, so get like 7 total utility, versus buy 3 beers, pay 12.5 or get 12.5 levels of happiness, and pay 5.7 cost, and his total happiness is actually going to decrease, or his total happiness minus his total cost is going to decrease, right? Because his marginal cost is going to be higher than his marginal utility, so it doesn't make sense for him to consume that third beer. So he's only going to want to consume the first 2 beers, because after that, his marginal cost is higher than his marginal utility. And, let's say he didn't have to buy beers as a single unit, he could buy half a beer. Maybe then he'd consume exactly until his marginal utility equals his marginal cost. But because we're limited to buying individual units of beer, he's only going to buy 2. So maybe in reality he'd want to buy 2.5 beers, but probably more likely he's going to be limited in reality to buying 2 beers. Okay. Now you guys can see my cat's butt. Okay. So when should Abby stop buying beer? He's going to consume as long as his marginal utility is greater than his marginal cost, which will be at 2 beers. Okay.